Mark stood at the edge of the old dirt road, staring at the decaying farmhouse in the distance. The sky was a dull gray, casting a cold, lifeless light over the landscape, making everything feel like it was stuck in a timeless limbo. As he approached the house, the silence became deafening, broken only by the sound of his footsteps crunching on the dry grass. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself was warning him to turn back. Yet, something drew him closer, an inexplicable pull that he couldn't resist. The farmhouse, though worn by time, still exuded a malevolent presence. The windows, shattered and dark, resembled empty, watchful eyes, and the porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. As Mark reached the entrance, a chill ran down his spine. The door creaked open with the faintest touch, as if the house was inviting him in, hungry for his presence. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of mold and rot. The walls were peeling, revealing dark stains that resembled claw marks, as if something had tried desperately to escape. Dust hung in the air like a suffocating mist, making it hard to breathe. But it was the silence that unnerved him the most. There was an unnatural stillness, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Every step he took echoed far too loudly, and with each creak of the floorboards, Mark felt as though he was being watched, followed by unseen eyes in the shadows. Suddenly, he stopped. In the corner of the room, near an old, rusted-wood stove, something caught his eye. A chair rocking gently back and forth. There was no breeze, no explanation for its movement, yet it swayed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a cradle. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to turn and leave, but his legs refused to move. The air grew colder, and he swore he could hear faint whispers, voices too quiet to understand, but loud enough to fill his head with dread. His breath hitched as he noticed the strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols that looked ancient, unnatural, and somehow familiar. Mark stepped closer, his curiosity battling with the gnawing fear in his stomach. As his hand brushed the surface of one of the symbols, a sudden, violent shudder passed through the house. The windows rattled, and the floor beneath him trembled, as if the house was alive, reacting to his touch. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the very walls were speaking to him, urging him deeper into the darkness. His vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, he saw something in the far corner of the room, a figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing motionless. It was just a shadow, a trick of the mind, he told himself. But as he blinked, the figure remained, unmoving, watching. The temperature dropped further, and Mark could see his breath in the air. The figure slowly began to move toward him, its outline becoming more distinct. Panic surged through him as he realized there was no escape. The door he had entered through was now closed, and no matter how hard he pushed, it wouldn't budge. The air was thick with an unseen force, pressing down on him, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. He turned back to the room, only to find the figure had vanished. But the rocking chair, now still, creaked once more, a haunting reminder that something, or someone, was still very much present. As he backed away from the chair, Mark heard the faintest sound, a child's laugh, soft and eerie, coming from the second floor. His heart raced as he stared at the staircase leading up, every fiber of his being telling him not to go, but his feet moved forward on their own. Each step felt heavier than the last, the wood groaning under his weight as though the house itself was resisting his ascent. When he reached the top, the hallway stretched before him, impossibly long and dark. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar, a faint light flickering from within. Mark knew that whatever was waiting for him beyond that door was something he was not meant to find. As Mark ascended the creaking staircase, his mind raced with fragments of memories long buried. There was something disturbingly familiar about this place, something he couldn't quite grasp, as if the house itself had once played a role in his past. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, and with each step, the whispers in the walls seemed to intensify, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched endlessly before him, cloaked in shadows, with a single door at the far end left slightly ajar, a dim light flickering from within. His heart pounded with a mix of fear and grim curiosity as he walked toward it, each step echoing like a tolling bell. Upon reaching the door, Mark hesitated. The light inside flickered like a dying flame, casting grotesque shadows across the room. He gently pushed the door open, and immediately, the smell of damp earth and decay filled his nostrils. The room was small and cluttered, but what drew his attention was an object resting on an old, dust-covered table, a small wooden horse. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was the same toy horse he had as a child, a relic of his forgotten youth, now impossibly here, in this cursed place. He hadn't seen it in years, not since the day his brother had vanished during a family trip to a farm much like this one. How had it ended up here? Why? The memories came rushing back, flooding his mind with an overwhelming force. He could see himself as a child, running through a field near a farmhouse just like this. His brother had been there too, laughing, playing. Then, as quickly as the memory came, it twisted into something darker. His brother's laughter turned to screams, desperate cries for help that Mark had tried to forget. His parents had told him it was an accident, that his brother had wandered off and gotten lost in the woods, never to be found. But standing in this room now, Mark knew that had been a lie. There had been something more, something sinister lurking just beneath the surface of those memories. As he reached for the wooden horse, his hand trembling, a sharp pain shot through his body. His chest tightened, and he stumbled backward, clutching at his side. His fingers brushed over something he hadn't noticed before, a scar, long and jagged, running along his ribcage. It throbbed with a dull ache, as though the house itself had awakened some long-forgotten wound. The scar had always been there, but he had never been able to explain it. His parents said it was from a fall, a childhood injury he couldn't recall. But now, standing in this cursed farmhouse, the pain became unbearable, as if the house was reaching into his very soul, forcing him to remember something he had desperately tried to forget. Suddenly, a soft sound broke through the oppressive silence, a melody, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was a lullaby, one his mother used to sing to him and his brother when they were children. The haunting notes drifted through the air, wrapping around him like a cold mist. Mark's pulse quickened as the song grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the very bones of the house. He looked around wildly, but there was no one else in the room. The toy horse remained still on the table, yet the room seemed alive with the melody, as if the walls themselves were singing. Then, as the final note of the lullaby faded into the air, Mark saw it, etched into the wall behind the table, nearly hidden beneath layers of peeling wallpaper. His name, carved deep into the wood, alongside his brother's. The sight of it sent a jolt of terror through him, his knees weakening as the weight of the revelation hit him like a hammer. This was no mere coincidence. This house, this room, had seen them before. They had been here long ago, and whatever had taken his brother had marked them both. The air grew thick, almost choking, and the room seemed to close in around him. His mind reeled, trying to piece together the fragments of his past that the house was forcing him to confront. His brother's disappearance, the scar, the wooden horse, everything pointed to a horrifying truth he had been too young to understand back then. The house had taken his brother, and now it wanted him too. Mark's vision blurred as the pain in his side flared, and the whispers in the walls grew louder, angrier, demanding something from him. The room spun, and for a moment, he thought he might faint. But then, through the haze of terror and pain, one thought cut through. He had to know the truth. He had to uncover what really happened that day, because whatever dark force resided in this place wasn't finished with him yet. And as the lullaby echoed once more, a terrible realization dawned on him. The house wasn't just a place. It was a predator, and it had been waiting for him to return. Mark's mind raced as the walls of the farmhouse seemed to close in on him. His breath came in short, panic gasps, the weight of the forgotten past pressing down on him like a vice. The wooden horse sat on the table, a grim reminder of the day his brother vanished. As the whispers in the walls grew louder, more insistent, something stirred in the shadows behind him. The air was thick with malevolence, and Mark could feel it. He was not alone. Slowly he turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure he had seen earlier, his brother. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The figure looked like his brother, same height, same hair, even the same clothes he wore the day he disappeared. But his face was wrong. It was pale, too pale, and his eyes were empty, void of life, staring blankly at Mark with an unnatural stillness. A shiver ran down Mark's spine as the figure spoke, but the voice wasn't his brother's. It was distorted, hollow, echoing like it came from the depths of a well. "You left me," the figure whispered, stepping forward. "You let them take me." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. He couldn't move, couldn't tear his gaze away from the ghastly figure that was now only a few feet away. The farmhouse seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the whispers rising to a fever pitch, filling his mind with fragments of half-remembered nightmares. His brother's figure stepped closer, and with each step, the room seemed to darken, the walls twisting and warping like a living thing. "You can fix it," the voice whispered, its tone eerily calm. "You can bring me back." A cold sweat broke out across Mark's forehead. The figure's words sent a chill through him, deeper than any fear he had ever known. "How?" Mark managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper. The figure's lips curled into a smile, twisted, wrong, more like a grimace than anything human. "You know how," it replied, "but it will cost you." Mark's mind reeled as the whispers in the walls seemed to merge with the figure's voice, a cacophony of terror swirling around him. "The memories," the figure said, "give them up, and I will return. I will be whole again." Mark's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and dread. Give up his memories. The thought was incomprehensible, terrifying. The figure stepped even closer, its presence oppressive, suffocating. "You can bring me back, but you must sacrifice what you hold most dear." The words hit him like a hammer. His most precious memories, his childhood, the moments with his family, the memories of happiness he had clung to during his darkest days, they were the price. He could feel the house pressing in on him, waiting, demanding his decision. He looked at the figure, which now stood so close he could almost touch it. The emptiness in its eyes bore into him, filling him with a deep, gnawing dread. "What happens if I don't?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by the question. "Then you stay," it said simply. "You stay, and the house takes what it wants, as it always does." The weight of the decision crashed down on Mark. His mind was screaming for him to flee, to leave the farmhouse and never look back. But there was something else, something pulling at him, deep inside. This was his brother, or at least some part of him, lost and trapped in this cursed place. Could he really walk away, knowing he had a chance to save him, even if it meant losing everything? He felt the memories swirling in his mind, the warmth of them, the comfort they brought. To give them up would be like tearing out a piece of his soul. But the alternative was unthinkable. He would be trapped here, just like his brother, forever a part of the house's twisted game. Mark's chest tightened, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out from the sheer terror of it all. His body trembled as he weighed the impossible choice before him, to sacrifice his most cherished memories, or to become another victim of the farmhouse's insatiable hunger. The figure watched him with those hollow, lifeless eyes, waiting for his decision. Mark could feel time stretching, warping around him, as though the house itself was holding its breath, anticipating his choice. The whispers in the walls grew quieter, softer, almost as if the house was giving him one final moment of peace before it devoured him whole. He could hear the faint echoes of his childhood, the laughter of his brother, the warmth of his mother's voice. To lose all of that, it would be like erasing himself from existence. But then, his eyes met the figure's once more, and he saw it. the faintest glimmer of his brother, trapped, pleading for release. Mark's heart clenched. Could he really leave his brother behind, knowing there was a chance to save him, no matter the cost? He had to make a decision. Slowly, his hands trembled as he reached out, toward the figure, toward his brother. The room darkened, the air thick with a cold, unnatural energy. Mark closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek as he whispered the words that would seal his fate. "I'll do it." In that moment, the house seemed to exhale, the walls shuddering as the whispers surged back to life, louder than ever, filled with a triumphant, malevolent glee. Mark felt the world tilt beneath him, his mind unraveling as the memories began to slip away, one by one, dissolving into the darkness. His vision blurred, and he could feel the warmth of his childhood fading, replaced by a cold, empty void. The figure before him flickered, then smiled, a haunting, terrible smile, as the farmhouse consumed its newest victim. The farmhouse was no longer just a decaying structure. It had come alive, feeding on the terror that pulsed through Mark's veins. After making his impossible choice, the air around him thickened, pressing down like an invisible weight. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch, twist, and move of its own accord, as if the darkness itself was a living, breathing entity. The walls whispered to him, faint, eerie murmurs that crawled into his ears and burrowed deep into his mind. The voices were unintelligible at first, like a distant wind carrying broken fragments of forgotten conversations, but as they grew louder, they began to form words, his name, repeated over and over, beckoning him deeper into the house's black heart. Mark's hands trembled, his mind reeling from the memories he had just sacrificed. He couldn't remember what he had lost, but the emptiness left behind was unbearable. It gnawed at him, a hollow ache that seemed to mirror the endless corridors of the farmhouse. His brother's figure had vanished, but the presence remained, stronger now, darker, as if the house had absorbed his brother's essence and now used it to taunt him. Mark tried to steady his breathing, but the shadows danced at the edge of his vision, teasing, mocking. Every time he turned, they slipped away, only to reappear just beyond his sight. The floorboards beneath his feet creaked ominously, groaning like a creature stirring in its sleep. The house, it seemed, was awake now, fully aware of him. With each step he took, the whispers grew more insistent, more demanding, as though the house was trying to guide him somewhere, perhaps to his final doom. The dim light flickered, casting grotesque shadows across the walls, and Mark swore he could see faces in the wood, twisted, anguished faces, their mouths open in silent screams. He blinked, trying to clear his head, but the faces remained, their eyes following him as he moved through the hallway. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and Mark could see his breath forming in the air. The chill was unnatural, cutting through his skin and sinking deep into his bones. As he rounded the corner into another room, the light from his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. Panic seized him, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest that he could hardly hear the whispers anymore. For a moment, he stood frozen, listening to the oppressive silence that had descended. But then, slowly from the far corner of the room, came a sound, a faint rhythmic tapping, like fingernails scratching against wood. Mark swallowed hard, forcing himself to move toward the sound. As he did, his flashlight flickered back to life, casting a narrow beam of light across the room. His heart sank as the light fell upon a large, ornate mirror standing in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. The tapping sound came from the mirror itself, but what he saw in the reflection made his blood run cold. It wasn't his own reflection staring back at him. It was something else, something far more sinister. A dark figure stood just behind him, its face obscured in shadow, watching him with hollow, lifeless eyes. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. Yet when he turned back to the mirror, the figure remained, closer now, its presence more defined. It leaned toward him, its breath visible on the glass, as though it existed only within the mirror's twisted reflection. Mark's hand shook as he reached toward the mirror, but before his fingers could touch the glass, the figure moved, swiftly, violently, pressing its hands against the other side of the mirror, as if trying to break free. The whispers in the walls surged, their voices frantic now, and Mark stumbled backward, his heart racing. As he backed away, the mirror began to crack, thin lines spiderwebbing across the surface, but the figure did not retreat. Instead, it began to push harder, as though the glass was the only barrier keeping it from crossing over into the real world. Mark could hear the groaning of the glass, the sharp snapping of cracks growing deeper, and then, without warning, the mirror shattered. But there was no sound, no crash, no explosion of shards. The glass simply fell away, dissolving into dust, leaving the dark figure standing before him, no longer confined to the reflection. It was taller than he had expected, its form cloaked in darkness, its face still obscured in a swirling, shifting mass of shadows. But its presence was undeniable, filling the room with an overpowering sense of dread. The whispers, now coming from all around him, urged him to run, but Mark was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer malevolence radiating from the creature. The shadows in the room seemed to bow toward the figure, as if it was the master of the darkness, commanding everything within its reach. Then it spoke. The voice was not a whisper, but a low, rumbling growl, like the sound of rocks grinding together deep underground. "You thought you could leave," it said, its words dripping with malice. "You thought you could escape." The shadows writhed around it, swirling in chaotic patterns that seemed to distort the very space they occupied. "This place has always been yours, Mark, and now you are part of it." Mark's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, the weight of the terror crushing him. The figure loomed over him, its form shifting, becoming more human-like, more familiar. For a brief moment, it resembled his brother again, but the eyes were wrong, cold, empty, devoid of the life that had once been there. It knelt down beside him, its hand reaching out, its fingers impossibly long and thin, brushing against his cheek. The touch was ice-cold, seeping into his skin, and Mark gasped, feeling his mind begin to unravel. The whispers in the walls reached a fever pitch, screaming now, filling his head with chaos. He could no longer distinguish between his own thoughts and the maddening voices of the house. The figure leaned in closer, its mouth near his ear, and whispered, "You belong to me now." Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the dark figure looming over him, its presence suffocating. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows, and now, it seemed, his mind was no different. Fear gnawed at him, twisting his thoughts, distorting reality until he could no longer trust his own senses. Every corner of the room seemed alive, the darkness pulsating like a living entity, watching, waiting. He tried to ground himself, to cling to some shred of logic, but the overwhelming sense of dread had sunk its claws into him, and there was no escape. Suddenly, the figure before him dissolved into a thick, inky shadow, merging with the darkness that surrounded him. Mark stumbled to his feet, heart racing, but the oppressive atmosphere only grew thicker, more tangible, as if the very air around him was feeding off his terror. The house had become a trap, a web designed to ensnare him, and the more he struggled, the tighter the grip became. His mind, now clouded with fear, began to betray him. Hallucinations, or were they, flickered at the edges of his vision. The walls bent and twisted, warping into grotesque faces that sneered and whispered his name, taunting him with half-formed words. His surroundings became a twisted reflection of his worst nightmares. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old house felt deliberate, like the building itself was alive and malevolent. As he moved through the hall, the temperature dropped further, and a thick, suffocating fog began to fill the rooms. The fog slithered around his feet, cold and damp, coiling up his legs like serpent, dragging him deeper into the house's clutches. Mark could barely see a few feet ahead of him now, and the whispers grew louder, more insidious, filling his head with twisted thoughts, fears, and temptations. As he tried to steady himself, Mark felt something brush against his arm. Soft, delicate, almost a caress. He jerked away, his pulse quickening, but there was nothing there. His mind was playing tricks on him, or perhaps the house was. Then he heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling his name. The sound came from a fog ahead, soft and familiar, dripping with sweetness. It was the voice of his mother, or at least, it sounded like her. The same soothing tone she had used to calm him as a child. "Mark, come home," the voice called. "Come back to us." He knew it was a trick. He knew it wasn't real. But the sound of his mother's voice, the one thing that had always brought him comfort, was impossible to resist. He took a step forward, his mind clouded with confusion. Memories of his childhood, distorted and fragmented, floated to the surface. The warmth of his mother's embrace, the laughter of his brother, the feeling of safety, all of it called to him from the depths of the fog, luring him into its grasp. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that if he followed the voice, he would find peace, that all the terror would finally end. But deep down, Mark knew better. The house was twisting his memories, using his most cherished thoughts against him. Yet, the temptation to surrender, to give in to the illusion, was overwhelming. The fog thickened, swirling around him like a vortex, and the voices grew louder, more convincing. He could see shadows in the mist now, figures from his past, ghostly images of his family, standing just beyond his reach. His mother smiled at him, her hand outstretched, beckoning him closer. "Mark, you don't have to be afraid," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." His heart ached with longing. The fear, the confusion, the isolation. It was all too much. The temptation to walk into the fog, to embrace the illusion of comfort and love, was almost overpowering. But something held him back, a small, flickering part of his consciousness that refused to be completely consumed by the darkness. He clenched his fists, trying to hold on to what little sanity he had left, but the house wasn't finished with him yet. As he took another step, the fog suddenly shifted, the warmth of his mother's voice fading into a harsh, guttural laughter. The figures in the mist twisted and deformed, their faces contorting into grotesque masks of agony. The fog churned violently, and the shadows of his loved ones dissolved into nightmarish forms, distorted, hollow versions of the people he once knew. His mother's face stretched into a ghastly grin, her eyes dark and sunken. "You will never leave," the voice hissed, no longer soft and comforting, but filled with malice. Mark stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The warmth he had felt moments ago had turned into a chilling dread, freezing him in place. The fog began to close in on him, the shadows stretching their arms toward him, their voices merging into a cacophony of terror. "Stay with us," they chanted. "Forever." Panic surged through him as he realized the house was feeding on his fear, using his most cherished memories to break him down, to make him weak. The figures circled him, their hollow eyes watching him, waiting for him to give in, to surrender to the darkness. He could feel his resolve slipping, his grip on reality unraveling. The boundaries between what was real and what was a twisted nightmare were dissolving, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could resist. Just when he thought he would be swallowed whole by the fog, a sharp, searing pain shot through his chest. Mark gasped, clutching his side. The scar. He had forgotten about it in the chaos. But now, it burned like fire, as if the house itself was punishing him for resisting. He dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. The pain bringing him back to the present, grounding him in the here and now. The fog still swirled around him. The shadows still whispered his name, but the pain anchored him, giving him a brief moment of clarity. Through the haze of agony and fear, Mark realized what the house was trying to do. It wasn't just feeding on his fear. It was trying to make him forget, to erase who he was, to trap him in an eternal nightmare. But as long as he held on to the pain, as long as he remembered who he was, it couldn't take him. The shadows hissed in anger, and the fog recoiled slightly as Mark forced himself to stand. The The scar throbbed, but he welcomed the pain now, using it to push back against the oppressive darkness. The house may have been alive, but so was he, and he wasn't ready to give up just yet. With a final, defiant shout, Mark pushed through the fog, ignoring the voices, the shadows, the twisted visions of his family. The house roared in fury, but he didn't stop. He wouldn't let it take him, not like it had taken the others. As he stumbled forward, the fog began to thin, the whispers fading into the distance. The house had tempted him with his deepest fears and desires, but he had survived, for now. But deep down, Mark knew the worst was yet to come. Mark stumbled into the heart of the farmhouse, a massive, decaying room that seemed to pulse with the house's malevolent energy. The air was thick and suffocating, as though the house itself was alive, breathing in the terror that radiated from him. His footsteps echoed in the silence, and as he stepped farther into the room, the oppressive weight of the place pressed down on him, filling him with a growing sense of dread. Something was waiting for him in the darkness, something ancient and hungry. He could feel its presence, lurking just beyond the flickering shadows, watching him, studying him. The room was littered with broken furniture and fragments of the past, but at the center, an altar of sorts stood, covered in strange symbols etched into the wood, pulsating with an unnatural glow. It was here that everything had been leading him. The whispers in the walls, the flickering images of his family, the scar burning on his chest, it all pointed to this moment. And standing before the altar, bathed in the dim, otherworldly light, was the dark figure he had been running from. But now, as he approached it, he realized something horrifying. The figure wasn't just a manifestation of the house's evil. It was tied to him, bound by a connection that stretched back to the day his brother had vanished. The figure turned slowly, and for the first time, Mark saw its face clearly. His blood ran cold. It was a twisted, grotesque version of his brother, but aged, decayed, as if trapped in some eternal nightmare. His eyes were hollow, black pits that reflected nothing but emptiness, and his skin was stretched tight over his bones, cracked and bleeding in places. But worst of all was the smile. The same smile his brother had given him as a child, now warped into a mocking, sinister grin. "You've come back," the figure rasped, its voice a sickening distortion of the familiar tone Mark once knew. Mark's stomach churned. He had hoped to find his brother, but this thing wasn't his brother. It was something far darker, a creature twisted by the house's malevolent influence. And yet, there was still something about it that felt painfully familiar. "Why you?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking with fear. The figure's grin widened. "I am what you made me," it hissed. "I am the one you abandoned, the one you forgot." The figure stepped closer, and with each step, the room seemed to darken, the walls closing in as the house responded to the creature's presence. "You didn't save me," the figure continued, its voice filled with venom. "You left me to rot in this place, and now I am bound to it, just as you will be." Mark shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't understand." The figure's face twisted with rage. "You didn't want to understand. You buried the truth because it was easier to forget." Mark's chest tightened, the weight of the guilt and fear pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he was overwhelmed by the crushing realization that this was all his fault. But as the figure loomed closer, its skeletal hand reaching out toward him, Mark felt something stir inside him, a flicker of defiance, a spark of the will to fight. He had come this far. He had faced the house, faced his past, and now he stood before the creature that had once been his brother. But this wasn't his brother anymore. It was the house's creation, a puppet twisted by its dark power, and if he didn't stop it now, it would consume him just as it had consumed his brother. The scar on his chest burned, the pain sharp and searing. It was a reminder of what he had sacrificed to reach this point, of what he had lost, and what was still at stake. He couldn't let the house win. Not like this. Gritting his teeth, Mark stepped forward, his voice trembling but firm. "You're not my brother," he said, forcing the words out despite the terror gripping his heart. "You're just a shadow, and I'm not afraid of you anymore." The figure stopped, its expression momentarily flickering with surprise. The house seemed to tremble in response, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, as if it sensed that its hold on Mark was slipping. The air crackled with tension, and for a brief moment, everything was still. Then, the figure lunged, moving faster than Mark could have anticipated, its skeletal hands reaching for him with inhuman speed. But Mark was ready. In a split second, he grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor, raising it like a weapon. The figure collided with him, and they both crashed to the ground, the impact sending a shockwave of pain through Mark's body. They struggled, the figure's strength far beyond what Mark had expected. Its hands wrapped around his throat, squeezing, choking the life out of him. But Mark fought back, his fingers digging into the figure's arms, his mind racing with desperation. The room around them seemed to warp, the walls bending and stretching, the symbols on the altar glowing brighter as the house fed on the violence, on the terror. Just as Mark felt himself slipping into unconsciousness, the scar on his chest flared with a blinding heat. It burned with such intensity that it forced him back into focus, his mind suddenly clear. In that moment, Mark understood. This was the house's last attempt to claim him, to break him completely, but was also his last chance to free himself from its grip. Summoning all his strength, he shoved the figure off him, sending it crashing into the altar. The room exploded with light, the symbols on the altar flaring brightly as the house howled in fury. The figure writhed on the ground, its form flickering and distorting as if it was being pulled apart. Mark watched in horror and awe as the house's power began to consume the creature, dragging it back into the darkness from which it had come. The figure reached out toward him one last time, its face contorted with pain and rage. "You will never be free," it rasped before dissolving into nothingness. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time since he had entered the farmhouse, Mark felt the air clear. The darkness that had clung to him so tightly began to recede. The house, though still old and decaying, no longer felt alive. It was as though the malevolent force that had controlled had finally been vanquished. But as Mark stood there, panting, bruised, and exhausted, he knew that the battle had come at a cost. He had confronted the darkness, faced the thing that had once been his brother, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. He wasn't sure if he would ever truly be free of the house's influence, but for now, he had survived. Mark stood in the center of the room, his body trembling, still reeling from the encounter with the twisted form of his brother. The farmhouse, once alive with a sinister energy, now seemed eerily still. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted slightly, but the air remained thick with the remnants of the house's malevolence, as if the entity was only lying in wait, not entirely gone. The darkness around him was deeper than before, more suffocating, and Mark knew that the final confrontation had only just begun. The house wasn't done with him yet. It had merely been playing with him, wearing him down for this moment. A sudden, violent shudder ran through the walls, and the ground beneath Mark's feet trembled as though the house itself was awakening for the last act. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a dark, slithering shadow creeping along the edges of the room, moving with unnatural speed. It coiled and twisted like a serpent, leaving behind a trail of cold, suffocating dread in its wake. Mark's breath quickened, his instinct screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere left to go. He was trapped. The doors were sealed shut, and the walls seemed to bend and shift, closing in around him. Then, from the heart of the darkness, it emerged. The entity that had haunted him from the moment he stepped into the farmhouse now revealed itself fully. It was no longer just a shadow or a flicker of darkness in the corners of his vision. It was a towering, grotesque form, vaguely humanoid but impossibly distorted, with limbs too long and twisted to be natural. Its body seemed to be made of the same darkness that filled the room, a black void that swallowed the light and reflected nothing. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a featureless mask of swirling shadows, with only two hollow, glowing eyes staring into Mark's soul. There was no mouth, no expression, but the malice emanating from it was palpable. The house groaned in agony as the entity stepped forward, the walls warping and cracking under the sheer weight of its presence. Mark could feel the air grow colder, the temperature plummeting as the creature drew nearer. Its eyes locked onto him, and Mark's mind was assaulted by a wave of images. Fragments of nightmares, memories twisted and corrupted, scenes of endless torment and despair. He saw his brother's face again, distorted and screaming, trapped within the darkness. He saw himself younger, standing outside this very farmhouse, watching helplessly as his brother was dragged into the depths. The guilt hit him like a tidal wave. "You cannot escape," the entity's voice rasped, echoing inside Mark's mind rather than through the air. It was not a sound. It was a force, heavy and ancient, pressing down on him with an unbearable weight. "You belong to me. You always have." The words crawled under his skin, cold and suffocating, as if the entity was speaking to something deep within him, something he had long tried to forget, the truth he had been running from, the terrible knowledge that this house, this darkness, had always been a part of him. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the creature moved closer. Every instinct told him to flee, to fight, but he was paralyzed with fear, trapped by the overwhelming realization that this entity was not just some random evil. It was connected to him, tied to his very soul. The whispers in the walls had returned, louder and more frantic than ever, and Mark could feel the house feeding on his fear, drawing strength from his hesitation. In that moment, the entity reached out, its elongated fingers curling toward Mark's chest, directly over the burning scar. As its hand drew closer, the pain in his scar intensified, searing through his flesh like fire. Mark fell to his knees, gasping for breath, the agony nearly unbearable. The entity hovered over him, its eyes glowing with malicious triumph. "You are mine," it hissed. "Your brother was only the beginning. You will follow him into the darkness, and together you will be part of me." The room seemed to darken further, the walls pressing in, as if the house itself was collapsing into the void the entity had created. Mark's vision blurred, the edges of his world fraying as the darkness began to consume him. But in that moment of utter despair, a single thought pierced through the fear, cutting through the fog that clouded his mind. This was his fight. It had always been his fight, and if he didn't act now, he would be lost forever. With a surge of desperate energy, Mark forced himself to his feet. The pain in his chest was unbearable, but he welcomed it. It was the only thing keeping him grounded, the only reminder that he was still alive, still fighting. He stumbled backward, away from the entity's outstretched hand, his mind racing for a solution, for anything that could give him an advantage. And then he saw it, the altar in the center of the room, still glowing faintly with the symbols that had drawn him here in the first place. Mark's eyes widened as a memory surfaced, an old legend, one his mother had told him when he was a child, about the power of symbols and their ability to bind or banish spirits. The symbols on the altar, they weren't just decoration. They were a seal, a barrier holding the entity within the farmhouse. If he could destroy it, maybe he could free himself. Maybe he could sever the connection between the house and the creature that had claimed his brother's soul. The entity seemed to sense his realization. With a shriek that shook the very foundations of the house, it lunged at him, its long, shadowy arms stretching out to drag him back into the darkness. But Mark was already moving. Fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror, he sprinted toward the altar, dodging the entity's grasp by mere inches. The ground beneath him shook violently, cracks splintering through the floorboards as the house itself fought to keep him from reaching his goal. Mark reached the altar just as the entity's hand grazed his back, a cold, piercing pain shooting through him. But he didn't stop. With a primal scream, he grabbed the altar with both hands and threw it to the ground. The wood splintered, the glowing symbols flickering and fading as the altar collapsed into a heap of broken pieces. The house screamed, a deafening, inhuman wail that echoed through the walls, and the entity recoiled, its form flickering violently, as though it was being torn apart. For a moment, Mark thought it was over. The entity writhed in agony, its form distorting and shrinking, the darkness that surrounded it beginning to dissipate. But as it fell back, it let out a final, chilling whisper. "This is not the end, Mark. You may destroy me, but the darkness will always be with you." With that, the entity dissolved into nothingness, swallowed by the shadows it had commanded. The house fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the darkness finally receded. Mark collapsed to the ground, his body trembling, every muscle screaming in exhaustion. He had won. The entity was gone. But as he lay there, gasping for breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, something that had followed him out of the darkness. The house was empty now, but Mark knew that its presence, the malevolent force that had claimed his brother and tried to claim him, would never truly be gone. It had left its mark on him, and that mark would never fade. As he stood to leave, he cast one final glance at the ruined altar, the broken remnants of his fight with the darkness. The house might have been defeated, but deep down, Mark knew the entity's parting words were true. The darkness would always be with him, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for the right moment to return. And when it did, he would have to be ready to fight it all over again. Mark stumbled out of the farmhouse, his body bruised, his mind clouded with exhaustion and fear. The oppressive weight of the house had lifted, but it left behind a haunting silence that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. The night was unnaturally still, with the moon hanging low in the sky, casting a faint, cold light over the decaying structure behind him. He had won, or so he thought. The entity that had haunted the farmhouse was gone, dissolved into the darkness from which it came. But as Mark crossed the threshold into the open air, something about the victory fell hollow. The darkness that had clung to him so fiercely inside the house still lingered, like an unseen presence just out of reach, whispering to him from the shadows. Every step he took away from the farmhouse felt heavier, as though the ground itself was trying to pull him back into the place that had claimed so many before him. He stopped, his breath visible in the cold night air, and turned to look at the farmhouse one last time. It was silent now, lifeless, but there was something about the way it stood there, looming against the horizon, that made his stomach twist with unease. Mark's eyes narrowed as he stared at the dark windows, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he thought he saw something move inside, just a flicker, a shadow, darting past the broken glass. His heart skipped a beat, and he felt a chill crawl down his spine. Had it really been his imagination? Or was the house still watching, still waiting for him to return? He blinked, and the movement was gone, but the unease remained. The night was too quiet, the air too still. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind that sneaks up slowly, waiting for the right moment to strike. As he turned to leave, the wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves on the ground, sending a cold breeze whipping across the back of his neck. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. But the cold wasn't just from the air. It was deeper, a coldness that had settled inside him, like the house had left a part of itself within him. The words of the entity echoed in his mind. The darkness will always be with you. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to forget, he knew those words held a terrible truth. The house had let him go, but it hadn't released its grip entirely. The scar on his chest burned faintly as he made his way back to his car, parked haphazardly at the edge of the overgrown path. It was a reminder, an inescapable mark left by the malevolent force that had tried to claim him. He ran his hand over it absent-mindedly, the skin still tender from the ordeal. The pain was a tether, keeping him connected to the house, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a physical wound. It was a reminder that the entity wasn't truly gone. It had simply retreated, biding its time, waiting for him to lower his guard. As Mark slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow dirt road ahead. He hesitated for a moment, his hand gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if some unseen force was trying to keep him there, rooted to the spot. The urge to look back at the farmhouse one more time was overwhelming, but he resisted. He knew what he would see: an empty, crumbling building, lifeless and abandoned. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching him, waiting for him to come back, to finish what had started. He drove in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The road stretched on, winding through the dense forest, but the further he drove, the more the trees seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening, twisting into unnatural shapes. His mind was playing tricks on him, he told himself. It was over. The house was behind him. But even as he repeated those words in his mind, the scar on his chest throbbed, and the whispers returned. Faint, almost imperceptible, but there. They clung to the edges of his consciousness, murmuring his name, reminding him that the farmhouse would never truly let him go. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel as a sense of dread settled over him like a heavy fog. The headlights illuminated a fork in the road ahead, but something was wrong. One of the paths, the one leading back to town, was obscured by mist, thick and impenetrable. The other path, narrow and overgrown, stretched off into the darkness, leading deeper into the woods. Mark frowned, his heart racing as he realized that the mist seemed to be shifting, moving as if it were alive. It wasn't just fog. It was the same darkness that had filled the farmhouse, creeping its way into the world beyond. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. The house hadn't let him go after all. It had followed him, or perhaps he had never truly left. The scar on his chest flared with pain, and the whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent. Come back. The words echoed in his head, pulling at him, urging him to turn around, to drive back to the farmhouse. He clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. He couldn't go back, not after everything he had faced. But the road ahead seemed to disappear into nothingness, as though the house had claimed even the world outside its walls. For a brief, terrifying moment, Mark wondered if he had ever really escaped. The memories of the night blurred together in his mind, the edges of reality fraying as the house's influence wrapped tighter around him. Was this just another trick? Another nightmare conjured by the entity to trap him in an endless loop? He couldn't be sure. The line between what was real and what was illusion had become too thin, too fragile. He slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the car forward, desperate to escape the pull of the farmhouse. The road twisted and turned, but the shadows followed, relentless and hungry. And then, just as he thought he had broken free, the whisper came again, louder this time, clearer. You will return. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. Mark's pulse quickened, and he glanced in the rear-view mirror. The farmhouse was nowhere in sight, but the shadows clung to the corners of his vision, shifting, waiting. He could feel it, the pull of the house, the darkness that would never truly let him go. The farmhouse might have been behind him, but its influence stretched far beyond its walls. And deep down, in the pit of his stomach, Mark knew the truth. The battle was far from over. The house had claimed his brother, and now it had claimed a part of him. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much time passed, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to come back. And one day, he would